Okay.
All right.
All right, Tim.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining us for this town hall on Zoom and Facebook Live. I want to talk to you a little bit before we start taking questions about the importance of you delegates and the damage that SB 54 is doing. As delegates, you're the gatekeeper of the Constitution. You're the ones who your neighbors, your friends, other people voted to vet candidates, to look at their voting history, to look how you feel they'll uphold and protect the Constitution. Everyone who is elected takes an oath of office, and they swear to protect and defend the Constitution from domestic and foreign attacks. Now, SB 54 makes it so they don't really have to vet. They can use big money to put commercials on TV and just convince the everyday voter that they're good. We need this delegate system all across the country. We need people to be able to vet and then let their neighbors know who they're voting for. This is what gives people like me a chance to win and go and represent District 3 in Washington, when I don't have to take the money like the incumbents do from California and from Washington and from large corporations and lobbying groups. You can't compete with that. And if you want your representative to stay honest, then this is the best system. So I respect the fact that you delegates are taking the time to look at me and ask me questions. One of the things I want to share with you, and one of the things that's most important, is over 10 years ago, when many of us activists started in Utah fighting the grassroots fight to keep the Constitution safe and secure, is, if not now, then when? When are we going to fight and protect and defend the Constitution? Every congressional member takes an oath to defend the Constitution, yet most of them don't as soon as they get to Washington, D.C. One of the most important things I want to do in Washington is every freshman congressman, every new congressman gets to do a welcome speech. And I want to ask all the other representatives in Washington why they violate their oath of office. Now, I'm not saying my opponent's a bad person, he's a good person, but when you take that oath to protect and defend the Constitution, and then you vote to take away our rights that were given to us by God, and the Constitution was made to defend those rights, you have to understand, when a congressman lays his hand on the Bible and raises his hand and takes that oath, he's making a covenant with God to protect those rights. So the vote for 6172 to reestablish the Patriot Act is a violation of 3 of our constitutional amendments, the 1st, the 4th, and the 5th. And those are not forgivable by me. So we're here today. I'm here to answer any of your questions. Do we have any questions yet? Not yet. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the other votes that was critical this year, and that was the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment started in 1972, and at that time it was a good idea, right? Equal rights for women. Who don't want women or anybody to have equal rights in our country? The problem with the Equal Rights Amendment, it's like the 14th Amendment. It's very vague and it's left open to interpretation. Supreme courts throughout the country, in Connecticut and New Mexico in 1999, has utilized the Equal Rights Amendment to justify abortion. And me and many of the people I represent, many of you delegates, are very pro-life. The Equal Rights Amendment expired, and our current Congress voted to extend the date of ratifying that amendment. And Republicans like Jerry Nadler have been pushing over the last 2 years that the Equal Rights Amendment is what they're going to utilize if Roe versus Wade is ever removed from the Supreme Court or nullified to justify abortions. Now, I have interviewed on my radio show lots of pro-abortion or pro-choice people. Now, one of the things they always told me is that a woman's right to have an abortion is absolute. And the reasons a woman might choose to have an abortion might be for financial reasons, emotional reasons, or many others. And one of the questions I used to love those pro-choice people, I love to ask was, okay, if it's a woman's right because of financial reasons, when does that mother's right end? What happens if the baby's 2 or 3 and all of a sudden they can no longer financially afford that child? If life has no value up till birth, then does life have value after birth? Because it's proven that the fetus is alive inside the human body. So I'm very pro-life. I'm very love the concept of protecting the unborn children. So many of those are killed every year. So the ERA extension that my opponent voted for was basically voting to give liberal states and other states ammunition to make abortion legal up until birth. And that is terrifying to me. When I mentioned the violation of the oath of office on our constitutional protected rights that God granted us, the Patriot Act that came around after 9/11 was one of the most controversial things when I was on the radio at that time. And Supreme Courts and circuit courts ruled that it was unconstitutional. It violated the First, the Fourth, the Fifth, as I said earlier. Now, the Patriot Act, Section 215 is what we're talking about. And Jerry Nadler, that same Democrat that's pushing the ERA, also sponsored the bill to extend the Patriot Act going on almost indefinitely, giving the NSA and government the right to collect data, do searches on our homes without warrants, to have third-party people like our phone companies or email to turn over all the information on us and then the people we contact for no reason, no proof, no court warrant. To me, the vote yes on that is totally unacceptable. And my opponent will say 80% of the Republicans voted for this. Well, if you look at the roll call vote, there is 196 Republicans in Congress. 136 voted no. So 80% math does not add up. So for me, those are the votes that matter. I don't care what we rename a post office, if we name it after somebody famous from that community, or if we do other things that really are meaningless and have nothing to do with our rights. We need to look at the votes that affect our liberties and freedoms. And we need to ask Congress. And that's why it's so important to me to give that freshman speech. It's one of the things I want to do most is ask our Congress to stop with the hatred, to stop violating our rights, to stand for the oath of office that they did, and hold them accountable under USC Code 5, Section 7311. That basically states that there are penalties for violating your oath of office. That section alone states that you should be removed from office and should not be eligible to hold office if you promote any form of government other than our constitutional republic. How many people in Congress promote us as a democracy? How many Democrats are promoting us as wanting to become a socialist nation? They're violating their oath of office, and it's a crime, and it's a removable crime. So I want to ask the Speaker of the House in my speech why she's tolerating people violating their oath of office. I don't want to be unreasonable. I don't want to be irrational. I don't want to sound angry, but I want to ask the questions that the people of America need answered. So I've been calling delegates almost every day, trying to reach out to every delegate. If you haven't spoken to me directly, you've received a message from me. And I hope with that message, you've looked at my town halls, you've went to my website, you're at least researching me and investigating. And I invite you to call me if you have questions, because I work for you. When we do this, when we run a campaign, we are interviewing with you for a job. We're not interviewing with Wall Street. We're not interviewing with lobbyists. We're not interviewing with special interests. We're interviewing with you to represent the people of District 3 of Utah. Not District 1, not District 2, District 3. So as I've been calling delegates, a lot of questions have come up. One of the questions that comes up quite often is the red flag laws happening around the country. Now, 19 states currently have red flag laws. 11 have red flag laws on the books. Utah's not one of them yet. We don't know what 2020 is going to hold for us. But red flag laws basically violate our constitutional rights. What it gives is a neighbor, a family member, a friend, they can go to government and say, we know that Mr. Aalders has guns in his home, and we feel he's a threat or a danger to the community. Well, then the local police can go into my house and remove my guns without court order, without a hearing, without a trial. And that violates due process. And then I have to hire lawyers, attorneys, and fight the system to prove that I'm stable enough to own my guns. There's something inherently wrong with what we're doing and the direction we're heading in our nation. So I am very pro Second Amendment. I believe we should be able to constitutionally carry in every state across this nation. I will fight for those things. On my website, you'll see my first 100 days in office, what I want to do. One of the most important things I want to do right now is get the economy back up and running. I would have voted with Mr. Massey, Congressman Massey, to not pass that stimulus bill. And it's interesting that now all the corruption of the stimulus bill is starting to come out. If our congressional people would have read this piece of legislation prior to just voting on it, they would have known it's not going to save America. $1,200 is not going to save Americans who are going months without jobs or might lose their jobs. And the $349 billion that was set aside for small business is already gone. And only a small percentage of small businesses received it. It was interesting to find out that the large corporate donors, the banks we bailed out in 2008, another large corporation who make multi-million-dollar donations every year to campaigns, were pre-filed or filed earlier than the stimulus bill even passing. And most of the $2 trillion+ went to them. Now, Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to John Adams in 1816, wrote that adding to the debt today and passing that debt on to our children is negligent. And I agree with that. Our country is negligent in its behavior with our debt. And we are jeopardizing communities, mom and pop shops, and main streets all across the nation. Now, we have learned certain things from COVID-19. I'm not saying COVID-19 is not a risk. We have learned that sanitizing your hands and washing your hands is probably a very smart idea. We've learned that some social distancing is a good idea. But those of you who are alive in the 90s and old enough to remember H1N1, remember that the mortality rate for H1N1 was much higher. And more people in the United States and worldwide caught N1H1 than have caught COVID-19. Yet, the media didn't make it such a crisis. The government then didn't make it such a crisis, and we didn't shut down anything. We lived through it. We worked through it. Hospitals took care of those that were sick, and some people died. And that's a travesty. Whenever anyone loses their life, it's a travesty. It's a travesty to the family, to the friends, and to the nation, because it takes away someone who might do something amazing for our country. But our economy is suffering. I've spoken to a lot of you delegates who own businesses, who believe you might end up shutting your doors or shuttering these businesses that you have had for, some of you 5 years, some of you decades. That is scary, that we are jeopardizing the financial future of Americans for a COVID-19 that has not produced the amount of infected people that they projected. Now, that might be because of the stay-at-home orders. That might be because of the social distancing. We don't know, and we'll never know. All I do know is that our businesses need to open up. Our economy needs to recover from this. And you don't understand, or government obviously don't understand, that just opening the doors of businesses don't mean it's business as usual. Most economists in the nation state that it will take years for customers to get back to the same habits they had before. The fear of this nation of being around people could cause people to go to movies less, to go to entertainment or gyms less, or out to restaurants less, or they're going to request at a restaurant that they not sit by anybody else. So habits have been formed during the stay at home that are going to take 2 to 3 years to recover. I was speaking with an airline executive the other day, and after 2008 economy crash, it took the airlines over 2 years to get to full planes and business as usual after 2008. They're predicting it's going to take 3 to 4 for airlines to recover on this. Now, airlines didn't ask for money, but they got money. So if we do not do something to smartly and wisely open back up our main streets, we are going to create a problem that is going to be more disastrous to our nation than COVID-19 ever was. So let's work on getting that. That's one of the things I want to do, is work with the president. Hopefully it'll be President Trump and not Joe Biden. And we can get the economy up and running, and we can do something for small businesses. Now, I'm not a person who wants government to bail out everything. But when government forces a business to shut down, that's a taking. See, it wasn't the choice of the business owner, the people who put a second mortgage on their house or had family and friends invest in the business. It's government taking that business. But I'm also not the person who wants to put our country more in debt. So if we're going to take from private industry, we need to cut from government. We need to cut the 1,300 plus agencies' budgets to help small businesses that the government forced to shut down. That's my opinion, and that's one of the things I want to work with. One of the other things is we learned a big lesson back with Obamacare when it was thousands of pages and over 1,174,000 words, when the King James Bible is only 74,000 words. So legislation is too big, consists of too many pages. Nobody reads it anymore. And every congressperson, in order to pass this legislation, gets to put money for them and their district in a piece of legislation. Now, Utah might think that's a great idea because their district gets a little bit of money, maybe 2 million, maybe 10 million, in some kind of a deal to build something or invest in something in their district. But Utah is also then paying for all other 49 states with every district in their state to have their pet projects. And it adds up to much more than the money they get in their piece of legislation. So these type of items should be handled by the states. If states need to invest in something, it shouldn't come from the federal government. So we need to make sure that legislation stands on its own merit. I want to propose legislation, and I've spoken to some of the congressional people that I know in Washington, D.C., and they agree that we need to try and get standalone legislation passed. The Constitution is standalone legislation. It talks about one issue, how government's supposed to operate. Wouldn't it be nicer if you wanted to look at a piece of legislation and it was 2 to 3 pages long and not 891, and you can see that it stands on its own merits? Now, I'm not promising that I can pass any piece of legislation. Any person running for Congress who says they can get something passed is either trading or giving away your money to get that done. I always love it when people say compromise. Yes, you should be able to talk to everybody in Washington, Democrats, Republicans, and try and get them on board with your legislation. And I've interviewed over the years every U.S. senator, every U.S. congressperson. I know them, and I'm not afraid to knock on their doors and talk to them. But what we have to realize is when they talk about compromise, they're compromising you, me, and everybody else in Utah. When they compromise, they're giving away more of your assets to accomplish something they want to do. Now, we have what they call give and take. Politicians always say it's a game. we don't want to play that game anymore because we're the pawns on the game board. And I'm tired of being a pawn. I'm tired of being that game piece that they compromise every time they want to pass a piece of legislation. So those are a few of the things I want to do in the first 100 days. My freshman speech is very important to me. Supporting the delegate system and the convention system in Utah is very important to me. Now, as a congressman, I know that's a state issue, but I can request that the new governor that's elected this time look at repealing SB 54 and strongly urge them to do this. This could be the last time the delegates in Utah can send a message to Washington saying, just because you're an incumbent, just because large amounts of your money comes from California or from special interest, doesn't mean that you get to spend that money to win over the non-educated voters to vote for you. We did it 8 years ago with Mike Lee in a great upset. That's part of the reason the money people and the people who'd been in Washington forever wanted SB 54. They didn't think it was right that somebody who had been in Congress for more than 18 years got voted out. This is why many of you want term limits. Now, Constitution never mentioned term limits. I've had people say, well, Amendment 22 mentions term limits. It does for the president. It doesn't say anything about Congress. I used to believe that the people themselves were the term limits, like the founding fathers, but the founding fathers also believed that people would be invested in what government was doing, that they would monitor the votes, monitor the money, pay attention to the corruption. And we've not done that. So I believe, and I will sign the current legislation requiring term limits for congressional members, because the longer they're there, the more susceptible they are to special interest money. I interviewed Jack Abramoff, the lobbyist who went to prison as the sacrificial lamb, and he wrote a book about how he owned almost every member of Congress, including the Utah representatives at that time. And he said it's very easy. You win them over with games to the Redskins or their favorite NFL team. You take them on golfing excursions. You buy them expensive state dinners. This is why your current representatives spend so much time in Washington. It's not reading the legislation. It's not researching the bills and then informing the people in their district what it is and what it's about and whether or not it's constitutional and what it's going to cost. It's because they enjoy the rock star lifestyle. This is why my pledge is I'm not going to spend the time in Washington, D.C. being entertained by lobbyists and special interests. I don't need to go out for the fancy state dinners. I'd rather come back to Utah, support a local restaurant, and take my wife and family out for dinner than go meet with lobbyists who I really don't care about their issues. Now, there are some issues that will be important. I will meet with pro-life people. I will meet with pro-gun people. And I will inform you of those meetings, and I will invite you into those meetings and share what they're saying and what they're talking about. Three of the things that I think most legislators don't do anymore in our country is ask these questions. Is this piece of legislation constitutional? How is it paid for? And if it costs money, where are the cuts going to offset the costs? There's a lot of things in Washington, D.C. that can be cut. A lot of agencies that were created back in Eisenhower or back in Roosevelt's time, and their mission statements have failed dramatically. I always love a government mission statement. Listen, government loves not fixing things, but they also love problems because problems allows government to expand. It allows them to come into your lives more than they're required to. Government never lets a good crisis go to waste on expanding the size and scope of one or more of their agencies. Even on state level, we're now seeing a piece of legislation that was just passed here in Utah that's going to form new committees to help us through the COVID-19. They're all paid by us. I also find it interesting when government makes congressional pay mandatory. My opponent, one of the biggest things he said in 2018 at the convention, and I remember this, was that if government can't set a budget, if government can't keep the economy running, or if government shuts down, he doesn't deserve to get paid. Then he goes ahead and votes for mandatory spending, that congressional pay is mandatory spending. That means no matter what happens, they get paid first. So government does not generate an income, except in the state of Utah with their liquor stores. Whole nother topic. I'm federal, but it's just one of those things. Government doesn't have products. They don't make a product. They don't create. They don't innovate. They don't generate income. Their income comes from you and I. And so it's interesting that they're cutting all our incomes, but everybody in government still getting paid. You can't tell me every agency in the federal government is essential. We've shut down the schools almost in every state, yet the Department of Education is still getting paid. They're not shut down. So these are issues that somebody in Washington needs to ask the questions. Why? Just tell me that. Answer me why. That's why one of the reasons I want to do is get on the oversight committee, which oversees the agencies, government waste, all those type of things, because I want to call in the agency heads and say, justify your budget. Here's your mission statement that you have listed on your website. You've been around for 40 years. What have you accomplished on your mission statement? Because most of them have accomplished absolutely nothing. So we need to make sure that these government agencies aren't just wasting money. So somebody needs to ask the questions, and nobody's asking those questions right now, and that'll be me. I also want to, if I make it through convention and I become the nominee for the Republican Party, I want to spend the next months meeting with the delegates and people in District 3, asking them what type of legislation they want me to propose and write up and draft, which will be unique in Washington, because right now legislators don't create legislation. They take credit for legislation, but lobbyists write all the legislation. We've gotten so far away from Congress doing the job they were outlined to do in the Constitution that it is crazy. Some of the other questions I've been asked, unchecked power. Government seems to not have any oversight over anything they're doing. They seem to operate with unchecked power. Agencies operate and create laws themselves without congressional approval. You don't vote for the people in the agencies. They're not elected officials. They are people who supposedly work for the government, but represent us, but we have no representative authority over them. We can open it up for questions. Are there any questions coming yet? So some of the other issues that I see in Washington, D.C. Right now, we're looking at another CARE Act. And this CARE Act will be larger than the $2 trillion of the first. Democrats like Nancy Pelosi right now want $2,000 a month paid to every U.S. taxpayer until 60% of the population from the age of 16 to 60 are employed. The problem with that is 42 million people in this country make less than $18,000 a year. So $2,000 a month is a raise for them. What's the motivation to go out and get that employment recommendation of 60% when you're getting paid more than what you would if you're working? So it terrifies me that they're setting these principles and guidelines that are set up to fail from day one. They also want to do a second stimulus for large corporations. The funny thing I find about this is the airlines and these large corporations have such good credit ratings that banks will lend them money, and they haven't asked the government for money. Yet the government wants to give them money. Why? Many small businesses are struggling, and now the SBA loans for those small businesses that were in this CARE Act are unavailable for them. And the $1,200 realistically was given to Americans to help pay their mortgage, pay their rent, make their car payment, and other things that were essential to life. It's interesting on social media, I see people talking about, how are you going to spend your stimulus check? Oh, I'm planning a vacation, or I'm going to go buy this because I've always wanted this new piece of technology, the newest Apple phone. These are the people that 2 months or 3 months from now are going to be evicted, and they're going to be asking the government, why? You know, you cost me the money. Well, we gave you the money and you didn't use it to pay rent. It's just one of those situations. $1,200 is not going to save Americans who are going to be out of work for 2 to 3 to 4 months. The average rent in District 3 is $1,200. So you basically got 1 month's rent. What about your car payment? What about your utilities? What about food? What about essential things to live? So we're not saving America with this CARE Act because it wasn't well thought out. It was a piece of legislation that they had in their drawers. They dusted off to reward campaign contributors, and they saw a crisis, so they pulled it out, dusted it off, rushed it through because Americans were living in fear. It's amazing that out of all the money that the Federal Reserve has given, they've given trillions, and the first stimulus package of $2 trillion, yet $349 billion went to small businesses. And in America alone, there are over 42 million small businesses. Utah alone has 543 registered small businesses. These small businesses are essential. They're the lifeblood. Small businesses make up over 60% of the workforce in America. What happens when they don't recover? Those are the things that scare me. So why I'm running for Congress? I'm running for Congress to protect and defend the Constitution, to ask the questions that activists and conservatives and constitutionalist people have been wanting asked for over 10 years. I want to do what representatives have been promising people all across this country: propose legislations that'll fix and change some of these issues. Now, like I've said before, if you want me to promise I can pass legislation being one of 435 people, I can't make that promise. Nobody can, because I won't compromise on liberties and freedoms that are protected under the Constitution and granted to us by God in order to pass a piece of legislation and put 10 bad things in to get one semi-good thing in it. That makes absolutely no sense to me. Voting on legislation that I haven't read, I won't do, or I'll vote no. My job is to read every piece of legislation. I do it now as a hobby. I'm one of those legislative nerds. So I like to see what government's doing, what rights they're doing, what they're putting forth in committees that could come out of committee. Legislation is proposed early enough that every representative across the country could read it if they wanted to, if they spent the time and the money we pay them actually doing the job they were hired for. They hire legislative assistants, they hire massive staff, or you pay for them to read the legislation. These people are influenced and catered to by lobbyists, and they tell their congressperson, oh, I read this, and this one section of this bill is amazing and you should vote for it. They don't say these 42 sections of this piece of legislation that's 800 pages is bad. So do we take a piece of legislation because it has one good things and 42 bad? Yes, we do it all the time, every day. And that's insane. So So we have some cool questions. Do I support President Trump? Yes, I do. I voted for President Trump. I have a Trump 2020 hat, multiple different colors, match my outfits. I think President Trump has done amazing things for our economy. And one of the most important things he's done is he has not bowed to the whims of either political party. He has tried to do what he said he would do in his campaign promises and his contract with America. Now, does President Trump always come across really as a nice guy on his Twitter or in interviews? No. But are we judging a president on how he behaves or on what he gets accomplished? Because if we're doing that, what about Clinton? No president's perfect, no person's perfect. I'm not a perfect person, but President Trump has tried to honor the things he said he would honor, and I support our president. That being said, I will not allow President Trump to violate the Constitution either. And I will hold the president or whoever is violating the Constitution, be it Republican or Democrat, accountable and ask them why. So that's my answer on that question. What's my views on illegal immigration? This is another hot topic because my opponent has voted for 2 different amnesty bills. Now, I'm the son of immigrants. My parents immigrated here from Holland. After World War II, they were held in work camps by the Germans in Holland. My parents came here to get away from socialist type governments. In fact, most people who came to America because of our constitutional republic. They came here, they wanted to help innovate, they wanted to participate in our economy, they wanted to embrace America and everything it stood for. My dad never raised me saying, you're a Dutch American. My parents wouldn't even teach me the Dutch language, which sometimes I regret because I was living in America, and if they were living in America and they were here in America and their kids are American citizens, then they wanted me to speak and learn English. So we did. We are a constitutional republic, are we not? Based on a rule of law. Now, the immigration laws in this country are flawed. If you are an immigrant here legally and you want to bring your spouse and your children, it might be 2 years for you to get your wife here, and it might be 10 years for your children to become legal citizens here. That's insane. There should be the same time frames and the same timelines. Now, I'm not a pro. I've spoken to some delegates who are immigration attorneys, and I want to sit down and draft a piece of legislation to fix the immigration laws. Nobody's even proposed fixing the immigration laws. We only fight about securing the border, which I believe we need to secure the border. But if you've spent any time on the border of the United States and Mexico, you would know that we have Middle Eastern terrorists coming across that border. We have people from Asian countries coming across that border. We have gun running across that border. We have child sex slavery coming across that border. So when it comes to securing the border, everybody wants to talk about how that's uncompassionate. How is it not compassionate to want to stop sex slavery? How is it not compassionate to want to protect us from terrorists? So we're not securing our border to stop people from coming to this country to seek a better life and embrace America. We're securing our border because that's what smart nations do. And I support the building of the wall. I support utilizing technology. I support utilizing ground penetrating radar, looking for the tunnels that the drug runners utilize, and multiple other things. But we're a nation based on a rule of law. I also understand that we have many people living in our country illegally today. And it is wrong to say we're just going to deport every single one of them. The cost of that would be astronomical. But when my parents came here, they had to have an employer sign a letter stating that they were participating in the economy. They had full-time employment and can provide for themselves. Many of these people Everybody talks about compassionate, that they're working and participating in society. Many of them aren't paying taxes. So let's put the responsibility on the employers who hire these people. If you want to hire these people and you have already, sign a letter stating how long they've worked for you, how their employment is. Let's check their criminal records and let's vet them and verify that they're here for good reasons. And we need to do that. So that's my stance on immigration. What do I believe our trade policy should be? Now, everybody gets upset, especially when President Trump put tariffs on the Chinese coming to America. What's interesting is I interviewed President Trump in 2010 when he wasn't president. He was just a businessman, and he wrote a book about Chinese trade and how it was so unfair and unbalanced. And I also love trade. So I went to the World Trade Organization multiple times, and I looked at what every country charges America to move different products in there. And it is a complex list because every item is listed separately. Fruit, you'll list it by fruit, clothing, manufacturing items. Everything's listed separately, and everything has a different percentage, and then they have an average. On average, for countries to ship products into America, we have no tariffs. But for us to ship items into China, the average at that period of time was over 30%, around 37%. And different items vary from 20% on up. So why do you think corporations move their manufacturing to China? Well, if they want to enter the Chinese market and to ship to China, they're going to pay 20 to 37%. But if they move their manufacturing to China, they're already in China. So selling their products in China, there is no percentage, and they can ship it back to America for free. So people always say it's unfair to put tariffs on these nations. I believe it's fair to put tariffs on these nations equal to what these nations charge us in tariffs. So if there's a 12% item coming from Germany, we charge them 12%. If there's a 30% item coming from China, we charge them 30%. That is fair trade, not unbalanced trade, which we currently have in America today. Okay. Do you support the Patriot Act? No, I hate the Patriot Act. I have fought against the Patriot Act since it came about after 9/11, when the circuit courts and the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional, especially Section 215. The Patriot Act allows the FBI, the NSA, government agencies to collect data on Americans without warrant, violating our due process. What does the Patriot Act allow? It allows them to go to our libraries and ask them what books we're checking out. It allows them to go to our email provider and get copies of every one of our emails. It allows them to go to Verizon or T-Mobile or whoever your phone server is and ask them for copies of our phone calls. Now, you think all that's protected. Since the Patriot Act, all your phone calls are recorded. All your texts are copied. And the government can request those from you. And they have certain keywords. If you talk about President Trump, they get that turned over to them without warrant, without you knowing it. It also gives the FBI the right, if they suspect you, of domestic terrorism. And I remember when Rand Paul and Ted Cruz stood on the floor of the Senate and talked about what domestic terrorism was. Anybody who collects a year's worth of food, anybody who has conservative values. These are the things, along with multiple others, that the government at that time considered domestic terrorism because you were a conservative. It allows them to wait outside your house, to wait until you go to work, enter your house and search your house without a warrant, remove items from your house or photograph your house and never tell you. So the Patriot Act was fought against by Rand Paul, by Ron Paul at the time, by Ted Cruz, by many other very constitutional Republicans in Washington. Yet it passed almost unanimously because at that time, after 9/11, Americans were once again, like COVID-19, terrified and living in fear of the next terrorist attack on America. And they would have done anything and sacrificed any of their liberties to protect them from that. But the Patriot Act had a sunset clause in it, and that expired. And HB 6172 would put an extension on that almost indefinitely, allowing the government to continue these practices on American citizens without oversight, without warrant, without a judge ruling. And my opponent voted yes for that. Now, my opponent says 80% of Republicans voted yes for that. There's 196 Republicans in Congress. 136 Congress people voted against it. So some people actually read and knew the violations of the Constitution and the violations to Amendment 1, 4, and 5, just to name a few. And it's really funny because this is the actual ruling from the court. And I have it here somewhere. So the ruling from the court basically stated, that record searches, it expanded the government's ability to look at records on an individual's activity. But it also significantly said what it violated in the court thing. Section 215 of the Patriot Act violates the Constitution in several ways. And this was the court's rulings. It violates the Fourth Amendment, which says the government cannot conduct a search without obtaining a warrant and showing probable cause to believe that the person has committed or will commit a crime. It violates the First Amendment guarantee of free speech by prohibiting the recipients of search orders from telling others about those orders. What that means is the government can go to Verizon and demand your phone records, but Verizon is under a gag order and can't tell the news media or anybody else that the government is asking for those records because the government don't want you to know what they're doing. The court also said that it violates the First Amendment by effectively authorizing the FBI to launch investigations of American citizens, in part for exercising their freedom of speech. So if you spoke out, you're a Democrat and you spoke out against President Trump, the FBI can launch an investigation into you for being a domestic terrorist. For conservatives, when Obama was president and you posted on Facebook that you think Obama's a bad president, they could label you a domestic terrorist, start an investigation, warrantless investigation, invade your house, invade your office, get your hospital records and all these things without a warrant. They said it also violates the Fourth Amendment by failing to provide notice, even after the fact, to persons whose privacy has been compromised. So normally to deliver a warrant and search your house, they show up at your house while you're there. They hand you a written warrant signed by a judge saying that they can search your computer. And that's the scope of the warrant. All they can do is search your computer. Now, they can show up when you're not home, search everything, and never even tell you they searched your house. They could copy your hard drive, copy the books, write down titles, photograph your bookshelves. They can do all this stuff without you ever knowing they were in your house. So those were a few of the rulings from the Supreme Court. So I am totally 100% opposed to the Patriot Act. I was opposed to it even after 9/11 because of that provision. I think there were certain things that were necessary for the government to do to protect us from terrorism, but not by spying on American people. Other delegates have asked me about things like the TSA. TSA was also created after 9/11. It was a fantastic act. Some government officials made lots of money because they are the ones who invented the body scanners and then forced every airport to get it. But airports are private entities, private corporations. Yet the government has TSA there as security. Don't most private organizations, if they want security or police at their location, hire them themselves? I think it's time to turn the TSA over to the airports and say, if you want to continue with the TSA, then you pay for it because it's providing security for Delta, for American, for United, and for all these other things. Why should Americans pay for it? If that's the case, we're going to start seeing TSA in football stadiums and soccer stadiums and baseball diamonds and all over this country, wherever anybody is. We're going to start seeing it at UTA. So we have to limit and protect our rights as U.S. citizens. So I have another question coming right now. So Facebook Live question. Reports from U.S. Intel say China deliberately hid the COVID-19 outbreak and that it came from a Chinese lab. How should the USA hold China accountable? Now, I've read those reports. I believe a lot of these reports. Unfortunately, China holds so much of the U.S. debt, and COVID-19 showed how we rely on China for all our pills, our pharmaceuticals, our medical supplies, our clothing, and most of our food. So can we hold China accountable? Yes, we can, because China also is dependent on Americans to buy their products. We built China's economy. After the trade agreements of 1993, China thrived because of American money. To ever doubt that a government would purposely release a virus into a population is naive thinking on anyone's behalf, because we have proof that America has done it in the past to test viruses. All countries have bio labs that are looking at bioweapons and then antidotes to bioweapons. China, if they're accountable, some people have suggested that all the debt that China holds on America be discounted for what it costs for America to get back up and running. So far, we're about $4 trillion into COVID-19. China has to wash away $4 trillion in debt. But how does that help the small businesses or the people? It washes away debt, and people don't individually have to take for it, but Americans have been damaged. I remember in the 1980s, Germany had already made compensation to the Jewish people who had served, relatives of Jewish people and surviving Jewish people who had served in their concentration camps. But in the 1980s, they had to compensate European people, Swedish, from Denmark, Switzerland, and all these people who were in work camps or concentration camps. And I remember at that time, my parents had the option of getting paid because they were both. And they said, we don't want money from a generation of German people who weren't responsible for the actions of their ancestors. The difference with this is today, it is this generation of Chinese government that is responsible for damaging American businesses. So maybe we should send China a bill for the small businesses that are going under and for the stimulus package that we're doing. If we place sanctions on China, it hurts China more than it'll hurt Americans. In 1942, Americans started creating everything. They converted car manufacturing to manufacture military equipment. So we can get back to manufacturing and doing crops in America and even seize the agricultural crops that China owns here in America. It's interesting because China owns a lot of our food. They own most of the pork that's in the nation, but they raise the pigs here in America, ship them to China, process them and package them in China and ship them back to America. It doesn't sound very sanitary to me that the pigs go on a boat for that long, slaughtered, then get processed in a meat plant in China and then get shipped back. It just seems like a lot of time frozen and unfrozen to get processed. But it's all on American soil, and we can put sanctions and do things to make China pay. Now, we have to verify that it's actually fact. We can't hold somebody accountable for something if we can't prove 100% that they did it. That's what America is different than most nations, is we do rely on due process and actual findings of guilt. So speculation is great. Proof is coming in. I don't have access yet to all that. If I'm in Congress, I'll see the reports on the national security. I'll know more about whether China is guilty of this or not. So Any other Facebook Live or any questions right now?
That original one I gave you, that had 3 questions on there.
Yeah, I got them all.
Got them all?
Yeah.
So put that down. Yeah.
So I'm running for Congress, and the delegates of this state have an opportunity to send a message to incumbents everywhere that we're tired of the status quo, that we're tired of the games in Washington, D.C., that if Utah can do it, any state can do it if they copy our convention system. Our local government in Utah shouldn't be trying to destroy the convention system. It's not wrong. It's not inappropriate. It's not a corrupt system. If you've ever been involved in the caucus system, you get to go to your neighborhood meetings, and we saw hundreds of people showing up at ours. And you get to elect somebody to represent you to go and place that vote. And then the delegates get to place that vote. And most delegates actually research and vet the candidates. There are some still who don't, but far less than the majority of the voters out there who are busy. I don't fault people for being busy, living their own lives, dealing with their own kids and their own issues in their family. But paying attention to what's going on in our government affects them also, more than most people want to realize. And it's frustrating because a lot of people feel they can't fix anything or change anything. And we've made mistakes in Utah. We've allowed people to stay in office for 38 years. And that's why term limits will come into play. But we can't allow people who violate their oath of office, swearing to protect and defend the Constitution, to vote for things like extensions of the Patriot Act, to extend the time of the ERA. How are we on time?
Yeah, 15 more.
Okay, so those are critical issues. Now, like I said, I always find it interesting in the commercials from any politician, any currently serving incumbent across the nation. I've Googled commercials from different people just to see what they tout during election year. And it's funny because most of these people you only hear from during election year. That's when they come back out and all of a sudden you're important to them. After they're back in Washington, the people who give them the money are the most important to them. The commercials they show don't show the votes like 61-72, the extension of the ERA, possibly because they're not proud of it. Possibly they don't want you to know about it. They show the things like, hey, I just voted to rename this library after this important person from Utah. I'm getting things done. Well, those aren't getting things done. Those are miscellaneous things that are part of Congress's job, but really don't affect your life in an everyday manner. The Patriot Act does. The extension of the ERA does. The votes for amnesty does. And I find it interesting when congressional people say, hey, I didn't read the bill. I talked to people. They told me it's a good idea. What people are they talking to? The lobbyists who wrote the bill, who brought them the steak dinner or slipped the cash in an envelope under their door? It's interesting to me how many of these people go to Congress worth $100,000 and 2 years later, they're worth multi-millions of dollars. You can't tell me there's something inefficient or wrong with this system we have in America today. The delegate system can be saved. This would be national news if an incumbent in Utah lost to the convention system. It'll also make the big money people in Utah mad once again, just like it did when Mike Lee ousted Bob Bennett. That's when SB 54 came about, because they could not believe the audacity of the delegates to vote against somebody who had violated so many of our constitutional rights, but had been there for so long that they felt they deserved to be there 10 more years. So the money people, and if you look at who was behind SB 54, it was the big money players in Utah. They didn't like that. And I guarantee they won't like it if an incumbent loses this time. But this is a convention only battle in District 3. Curtis filed with 30 minutes left on the last day. I filed with 10 minutes left on the last day. He didn't think he had an opponent. Now he has an opponent. Now it's in your hands. I recognize that I work for you, and I want to spend most of my time in Utah, and I want to form committees with the delegates who hired me, but I want to talk to the Democrats, the Libertarians, the Constitution Party. Part of the problem we have in America is when you're elected as a Republican, you forget you represent everybody, and everybody has an opinion. Yet, you can't allow public opinion to override your oath to the Constitution. And so many people do. So those are the reasons. I don't think my opponent's a bad person. He's not a bad husband. He's a good man. He's a very pleasant person to talk to. If me and John Curtis met any other time, he could possibly be a friend of mine. But I'm not judging John Curtis on how nice of a man he is. I'm judging John Curtis based on his votes that violated his oath of office. And to me, that's unacceptable. And if I violate my oath of office, I expect the delegates to hold me accountable. I expect the Republican Party of Utah County to sanction me through their central committee. I expect to be held accountable for what I do to protect your liberties and freedoms. And like I said, if there are issues you want me to address that don't affect constitutional protected amendments, I'll fight for those as long as we can find a way to pay for them that's not putting our nation in debt, that's cutting our debt. So my name's Tim Aalders. Just so you know, that's 2 A's. It is unique spelling because my parents immigrated here from Holland. That's Aalders. We're going to be doing another town hall tonight at 5:30. My speech is getting done and uploaded, and we'll be doing town halls all next week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, before the voting opens on Thursday. I'm also available for you to call. 801-706-1484. If you have a specific question that you don't feel I've answered, call and ask me. I can't answer every question if I don't know what the question is. My issues are on my website, like I said, timaalders.com. On Facebook, it's Tim Aalders for Congress. You go there. If you like what you're hearing, the way we do this is grassroots. This is as much your campaign as it is mine, because I work for you. You need to help advertise your campaign. If you see something you like on my Tim Aalders for Congress, post it. If you like me as a candidate, tell people about it, because we can make a difference in Washington, D.C. We can give that speech and ask Republicans and Democrats alike why they ignore their oath of office, why they have done things like the Patriot Act, why they violate the Constitution, why they have massive bills to reward campaign contributors and forget about the American people during COVID-19. These are questions I want answered, and there are questions you probably want answered. So join us tonight, 5:30. It'll be on Facebook Live. It'll be on Zoom again. We will text it out with the number and way to contact. Check your email, because we email this stuff out on how you can join us. You should be getting emails from me, direct mail from me. My commercials should be hitting your TVs this weekend. So, and you can see them on social media too. We are a legitimate campaign, but it's our campaign. This isn't Tim Aalders for Congress. This is District 3 seeking to change Washington, one congressional candidate at a time. Together, we can make a difference, but it's not just me. You have to understand, I'll be fighting for principles of the Constitution. I will not sacrifice those principles. One person asked me if I would sign off on a piece of legislation that violated the Constitution, but gave District 3 money in a different category. And the answer is no, because you're not hiring me to bring you money that you already have that the government takes from you. You're hiring me to protect your freedoms and liberties. And the only way I can do that is with your support and your recommendations. I want to thank you. I want to thank Chris Harrod. I want to thank Morgan Philpott, people who started this fight with me over 10 years ago and joined me in fighting against the Patriot Act back in those days and many other things. And I'll see you tonight at 5:30. Thanks.